Jason Roth, agronomist with Winfield United. Last time we talked about the value that fungicides can bring to optimizing return on investment for soybeans as we wrap up and finish out the year here in the reproductive window. But now I want to turn and just talk about a few other management opportunities that we have in order to finish strong and get as many bushels in the bin as we can. With right now, it looks to be a pretty good soybean crop throughout a lot of the territory. So first of all, last time we talked about this sweet spot, this ideal timing in terms of these fungicide applications. If you're going to do a single shot approach, it's usually that R3, R4 window. But we didn't necessarily get into the details of why that is. And I just want to give a little physiology as to why this R3, R4 window is so important in a soybean crop. So first of all, let's think about what's going on in the plant. As we get to R2, that's full bloom, we have only accumulated about 25% of the biomass in the plant, only half of the nodes on that plant. So when we think about corn, we often talk about a grand growth stage of corn, and that's when it goes from knee high. Often we think of the reproductive window, tassel. But in soybeans, we do have a grand growth stage, but that grand growth stage begins really at full bloom, flowering, where we're going to start accumulating massive amounts of biomass. And with that massive amount of biomass production comes a big appetite. So we've got rapid accumulation. And so that means lots of nutrient being taken up. So we have nitrogen fixation rate going up in the plant. We've got nutrient uptake going up in the plant. And we have a plant, because it's so active and producing so much, defoliation or stress can cause high yield loss. So here's a nice graphic from the Soybean Growth and Development Handbook from Iowa State showing you visually all that's transpiring in the soybean plant as we get into this reproductive window at R3 and R4. We've got that vegetative growth still happening, right? We're producing a lot more leaves, trifoliates, getting more height. We're producing flowers, pods, and we're starting to fill those pods at the same time. So all of this is transpiring, and flowering is going to start wrapping up. So as we start reducing flowers if we stress, right, we're not going to be able to replace those flowers with any new flowers because we're going to be finishing that window. So as we have all this production going in place, we have massive amounts of nutrient uptake. This is a nice visual showing you from Flannery 100 bushel soybeans and how hungry they can be at a per day during this grand growth stage in terms of nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus. And not only are we going to have massive amounts of macronutrients being consumed, that's also going to be true with our micronutrients. We're going to have enough zinc, are we going to have enough manganese, sulfur in the plant to feed this heavy production that's going on. And so as we get into that full pod stage, that R4 and getting into that R5 early seed fill stage, that is when stress can cause maximum yield reductions. It's when we're really sensitive to stress. And that's because of, as we've already talked about, that accumulation of dry matter, the completion that we're having of flowering, and the seeds in the pods that are young and that are very prone to abortion. And so if we get water stress, if we get heat stress, if we get leaf loss from hail, leaf loss from insect feeding, leaf loss from diseases, or leaf stress from nutrient deficiencies, that can increase that flower abortion, that pod abortion, or that can cause reduced seed numbers in our pods. And so when we get that stress, that leaf loss, as research would show from R4.5, that late pod to early seed stage, we can have yields reduced up to 80%. So again, there's a really sensitive time in a soybean plant because it is doing so much in terms of its production. So one of the things besides disease control that we talked about last week that we can manage nutrients. And so when we look at tissue sampling and the history of tissue sampling, we see that we have lots of manganese deficiency, right? Yeah, we've got some macronutrient deficiency as well. That's fairly common. We're not going to talk about that as much right now, but we want to think about what we can manage from a foliar perspective in this crop. And manganese deficiency is very, very common in soybeans. And so, is there value in addressing manganese and manganese deficiencies from a foliar perspective? The answer is yes. So, here's some old data from the Illinois Agronomy Handbook. And it's really interesting because it's showing manganese applications and it's showing it at different times, either one application or multiple applications at varying times. And so, first of all, we see 56 bushel soybeans, not bad. But if we do one application of manganese and we do this early in June, still in the probably the vegetative stages, yeah, we saw, or maybe early flower, right? We saw a little bit of bump in yield, right? We saw 7 bushels from that manganese application. But if that application occurred later into that R3, R4 timing, that more of a sweet spot, we saw a greater benefit from that manganese application. Why? Because the plant is consuming more during that time, and so it's got a bigger appetite. And then when we went to multiple applications, you saw an even greater bump in terms of yield from those manganese applications. Look at some more recent data, Max and Ultra manganese in our answer plots, untreated 60 bushel beans. When we applied at R3 with Master Lock to give us better deposition, we saw about 65 bushel, about a 4.5, 5 bushel bump from that manganese application. The more data from answer plots from 2014 that's a little bit more insightful is looking at tissue sampling. When we think about managing soybeans well, we think about tissue sampling to get a real a precise measurement of what that crop is struggling with and what its needs are. If we have manganese or we have manganese that's not deficient, it is, in other words, sufficient in those soybean plants, then applying manganese wasn't that beneficial. But if we had deficiency in manganese, we saw a yield bump, significant yield bump from that application. And the other thing we learned is looking at the timing of the application. Similar to the Illinois data, that early application gave us a yield bump. But if we waited and applied during that R3, R4 timing, more of a sweet spot, we saw a greater yield improvement from that application. So the value of having tissue sample data and applying a macro or a micronutrient like Maxen ZMB or Maxen manganese to address those manganese deficiencies in our crop when they most need it. And the other stress that we can occur besides nutrient stress is insect stress, right? Pests that are feeding on tissue, that are feeding on pods and feeding on seeds. And so we know year in and year out, some of these guys are big players. We've had pockets of droughty weather, drier conditions, and those sometimes can really exacerbate our pests feeding. And so some common insects that we have here that hinder our yield production, and then also some insecticides that then tend to prove very fairly effective in treating those pests. And so, as we think about perhaps a fungicide application, that R3, R4 timing, or here's to think about: are there other things that we want to have in the tank, and is it justifiable, right? So, an insecticide or a nutrient, like we just talked about. So, we think about insecticides being applied. Here's an example showing you control. When we add that insecticide in to help bring pest control and decrease leaf and pod feeding, we saw a 10 bushel bump. This was in Texas. This is a higher disease pressure, but it illustrates the value of insecticides when we have pest pressure. And the other thing it illustrates is the value, again, of Master Lock. So I shared last week the value of Master Lock for controlling droplet size and getting more uniform deposition in the canopy. And I had a question posed, hey, that's true for fungicides, perhaps in corn. What about in soybeans? We have soybean data that would show the value of Master Lock as a drift and deposition aid. Had a couple of people ask me that over the last 2 weeks. The answer is yes, we have data that validates Master Lock in soybeans. Here you see the value of that from 2 bushels with an insecticide application. And now here's some data that shows Master Lock being applied with fungicides looking at disease control. So here we have Cercospora, pretty common disease in soybeans. We have an untreated check and looking at it day of application, days after application 7, and then 14 days after application. And so the untreated check, we see Cercospora pressure on the rise. When we add a fungicide like Priaxor, we see at the day of application the same level of disease pressure. But when we come back 7 days later and 14 days later after application, we've seen a decrease in Cercospora due to that fungicide application. So that's the value of fungicide. But what about the value of Master Lock with the fungicide? Here, as we add Master Lock, we see the same disease pressure at the start. But as we've added Master Lock to the Priaxor, we see a greater reduction in the disease pressure, both at 7 days and then at 14 days after application. And so the value of getting greater deposition in the crop canopy, right sizing our droplets to get more of the valuable fungicide or the valuable insecticide or that micronutrient deposited uniformly throughout the crop canopy to give us a higher return on our investment from that input. I hope that gives you some ideas and some insight into why physiologically some of these applications in terms of management are really helpful, and what the value can be from fertility products like Maxin Ultra Manganese or Maxin ZMB, and then also thinking about insecticides, and then of course pairing those with Master Lock to get them more uniformly distributed throughout the crop canopy. Thanks for your engagement. Hope you have a great day.